This film is about the early years and escalating fame of Salvador Dali, one of the best known and most controversial artists of the 20th century. Dali died in 1989. His personality had become as well known as his paintings. He created his own museum in Spain, which draws crowds of tourists each year. His work continues to influence contemporary artists and the advertising industry. But this is also a film made during the writing of a biography about Salvador Dali by the Irish author Ian Gibson.
And the great man himself. Bonjour, Señor Dali. ¿Cómo estamos?
The problem for any biographer is to separate fact from fiction, particularly difficult with someone like Dali, who loved to cultivate confusion.
Only idiotic people tell the truth.
Only what people?
Idiotic.
Idiotic people? Only stupid people tell the truth.
Because myself, I'm very intelligent, never tell the truth.
Never tell the truth.
The idea of writing a biography of Dali came to me in 1986. I wanted to talk to him about a biography I'd written about his great friend, the poet Federico García Lorca.
Televisión Española dispone de un buen testimonio.
Dali was desperately weak, but he told me fascinating things. And as I looked at him, as I listened to him, as I heard his hand knocking on the table, I could see that there was a terrible tragedy behind the mask, which was already a crumbling mask. As I left the room, feeling rather sad, because clearly he wasn't going to live for very much longer, I decided that I might begin to investigate his life. It was tremendous to see this huge German monster churning out these Dali stamps in this mint. I mean, this place is sort of magic. I think Dali would have really enjoyed it. And to see his great masturbator, hundreds and hundreds of masturbators. Dali was the greatest exhibitionist the world has ever known, and I would think probably one of the greatest masturbators. I think it's terrific. He put masturbation on the map. I think it's very important that masturbation should be on the map, an acceptable human activity. Gala, of course. Dali's Russian wife, Gala, was an enigmatic person who never spoke publicly about their relationship. But he would not be the Dali we know without her. Cadaqués, the isolated Catalan seaside village on the Costa Brava, was an equally important source of inspiration. Dali's family spent their summers in Cadaqués. As a child, Dali grew to love the village and its surroundings with fanatical intensity. I realized that my first task as his biographer was to explore his childhood paradise around the little house where the family came each year. When Dali was a child, there was no road, so they could walk straight down onto the beach from the house. I mean, they were right at the edge of the sea. It was a very sort of lonely place, away from the center of Cadaqués, a private beach. And here Dali discovered a tiny microscopic world that fascinated him for the whole of his life.
Onto the mineral impassiveness of this Cadaqués landscape, I projected, day after day, all the accumulated and chronically unsatisfied tension of my erotic and sentimental life. I alone knew the exact itinerary of the shadows as they traced their anguishing course around the bosom of the rocks.
To start with, there were these extraordinary rocks, which can be sort of pitted very easily by the wind and by the waves. they suggest all sorts of things. You look at them and suddenly you see a little face or a little animal, and of course they change with the light. The place looks completely different at every point in the day. This, I think, also fascinated Dali, these metamorphoses which occur constantly among these rocks, and which I think influenced his whole way of looking at the world. So that Dali's double images, for which he's so famous, I think derive from this landscape. Dali would explore these holes and find bits of flotsam and jetsam, a stranded fish or some little object. And in his paintings you find these holes appearing full of queer things like keys and nails and whatever. He always remembered these rocks when he was in America, when he was in France. And they recur again and again in his paintings. Sea urchins. It was Dali's favorite food, and when they wanted to celebrate something, they had a sea urchin feast, a garotada, the greatest food in the world. Hey, I've just seen that. It's terribly important what we've just seen. That is a little fish that fascinated Dali and which terrified him at the same time. It's called a slobberer, a babosa in Catalan.
I have just looked at the face of the slobberer, I cried out to my father, and it was exactly the same as the grasshoppers, that loathsome insect, horror, nightmare, and hallucinating folly of Salvador Dali's life.
The Secret Life is a minefield for the unwary biographer. But one thing that does ring true is the influence on Dali of his formidable father, filmed here by Luis Buñuel, no less, in 1930. Dali was born and brought up in the sophisticated market town of Figueras, 20 miles inland from Cadaqués, where his father was a successful lawyer. When Dali was 8, the family moved into a fine apartment further down the street. And up here on top, Dali had his own private kingdom. He always liked to be on top of things, and he was on top here. This was his place, and nobody else was allowed to come up. And in here, and I find this really very moving, this was Dali's first studio, his very first studio, which is a wash house, an abandoned wash house. And he used to sit in here in this tub, and when it was very hot in the summer, to fill the bath with water, sit in there naked and draw.
It would be interminable for me to narrate all that I lived through inside my laundry tray. But one thing is certain, namely that the first pinches of salt and the first grains of pepper of my humour were born there. And I was vaguely, confusedly aware that I was in the process of playing at being a genius. Oh, Salvador Dali, you know it now. If you play a genius, you become one.
This, of course, was Dali embellishing history at the age of 38. Dali's first studio. And oi, Christ, I nearly knocked my head off. The view from here used to be fabulous, and I brought with me a reproduction of one of my favorite Dali paintings, which was painted from this position. And the painting shows what this place was like in the mid-1920s, when Dali was a young man. And there he began to paint, and he produced this masterpiece with the sun going down on the coastal range, the mauves and the violets, and the girl at her work on the terrace. Today, it takes half an hour to drive to Cadaqués from Figueras. But when Dali was young, it was very cut off indeed. Cadaqués was the perfect subject for a fledgling painter, and one of Dali's childhood friends still lives there.
The light of Cadaqués probably made the funny colors of his paintings, because his paintings had a sort of very bright colors, but not the usual coloring, something which he made up. It's an invention of his. And he's done it since he was a child, because I remember the first things he painted. He painted on cardboard or bits and pieces that he found in the house, and the coloring was beautiful.
Now, is it true that your father gave him his first box of paints?
Yes, that's quite true. Father said, well, if you like to paint, I'll give you a box of colors, and so he gave him his first box.
So that's not true about Siegfried Burman giving...
No, that's not true.
It was your father.
It's a quite big lie.
A big lie.
A big lie.
I think we better talk about that later on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
shall we go and see some...
Yes, I'll show you the Dali's, and then I'll show you the Burman painting, too.
Lovely. The problem is that a lot of the big lies were propagated by Dali himself.
I can't...
I think that Rosa Maria's memories are probably more reliable. She herself has lived here all her life, translating English and American novels into Spanish.
This is me.
That's you.
And this is my guardian angel.
Yeah, how did Dali become your guardian angel?
Because he wanted to buy me.
To buy you?
Yeah. And Mother said that wouldn't be practical because I had to be taken care of, and he was very young. He was just 6 years older than I, and that he wouldn't probably be able to do it. But then she would name him my guardian. And please promise that you'll always take care of her and you'll always watch over her. And he did.
Now tell me, Rosa, about the grasshoppers. What's all this about the grasshoppers?
Oh, that was a terror. He was horrified of the grasshoppers, but horrified.
And are those the creatures that appear in Dali's paintings? On the mouth, stuck to the mouth of the great masturbator? You know,
yes, well, I mean, they have a mouth and they have teeth, but they are big like this, big one. Yeah. We used to do that because we like to have the grasshoppers catch our noses. But then Salvador was horrified of this. He pushed the children. Ah! It was terror, pure terror, even when he was grown up.
I'm standing on the prow of the peninsula in Cadaqués, Es Sortel. And across the bay is one of the most picturesque lighthouses, the lighthouse at Calanans, and which marks the southern confine of his childhood paradise. It's August, it's hot, it's sweaty, it's sexy. There are lots of bodies lying around, bodies that Dali would have enjoyed watching down here on the rocks. Some are big, some are small, some are in between. But from where I'm standing, they all look pretty good. In his early paintings, Dali experimented with different styles. But voyeurism was to be a constant theme. I knew it was very important for me to talk to Antoni Pichot, who helped Dali in his very last years and who had put me in touch with him in the first place. He was from the family of cultured bohemians who had befriended Dali as a boy. It was his uncle, Ramon Pichot, whose impressionist paintings had first inspired the young artist. Pero realmente, Antonio, estoy viendo que la relación de los Dalí con los Pichot es fundamental en la vida de Salvador y en su obra.
No, fundamental.
Que sin vosotros no hay Dalí, vamos, Dalí es diferente.
Bueno, Dalí hubiera sido exactamente Dalí, pero fue una gran influencia la que tuvo la familia Pichot en él y que le dio impulso, y eso Dalí lo reconoció toda su vida, que no solamente el Pepito y la familia Pichot, sino también la pintura de Ramón Pichot, el impresionismo.
Un ciprés.
Un ciprés
Porque he
inmenso.
estado mirando aquí al ciprés.
Yo vivo junto al ciprés, es un ciprés maravilloso.
¿Y Dalí apreciaba este ciprés?
Bueno, cada vez que venía aquí, lo primero que hacía antes de saludar a la familia ni a nadie, saludaba al ciprés.
No me digas.
Le daba un gran abrazo y entonces decía una cosa que yo dudo un poco de que fuese cierta, decía, lo he plantado yo. Pero como todas las cosas de Dalí que eran un poco a veces dudosas, tenía una base de realidad. Seguramente él debió vivir los días que con Pepito hacían labores de jardinería aquí en Cadaqués, en los primeros años del siglo. Este es Pepito ya mayor con el niño Dalí y es el primero que dijo que Dalí era genial, que Dalí esto lo recordó toda su vida. Y esta silla que veis aquí es exactamente esta mía.
¿Esta silla?
Sí, completamente la misma. Sí, siéntate así.
Bueno, vamos a ver.
¿Ves? Fíjate.
Creo que Ana María tenía la espalda más bonita que la mía, profe.
Es que era la modelo. Mírala, aquí está. Aquí también.
Sí.
Siempre aparece Ana María en todos los momentos. Era un personaje fascinante.
Mira. Ana María Dali, 5 years younger than Salvador, was his principal model until the mid-20s. It was an almost incestuous relationship, and she felt cruelly rejected when later displaced by others in his art and affections. No me caigas encima, Antonio.
Lo procuraré.
Que caigas en...
The Monte de la Torre impressed me as a magic spot. It was made on purpose for the continuation of my waking fantasies and dreams.
This catalogue weighs 2
fuerte
kilos.
esto, sí, ¿no?
The height of the summit of the tower where I found myself exceeded everything I had imagined.
Of course, Dali, who was only 12 at the time, remembered the tower as being much taller than it really was. Dali linked this spot to an image that occurs again and again throughout his work, the wooden crutch.
In the center of the terrace was standing, slightly leaning towards the right, my rain-soaked crutch, which now projected an elongated and sinister shadow on the tiling lighted by red sun rays. Since then, that anonymous crutch was and will remain for me till the end of my days, a symbol of death and the symbol of resurrection.
Pero él siempre relacionaba la muleta con la impotencia, ¿no?
Con todo.
Con esas formas
con
flácidas
todo.
que
Sí.
se apoyan en,
Sí.
en muletas.
Sí, con la impotencia y con la falta también de seguridad, ¿verdad? Con la inseguridad. Era un signo de apoyo, era algo necesario. Todo lo que es flácido, todo lo que es blando,
Sí.
necesita un apoyo.
You like crutches a lot?
Yes, because it's one symbol of impotency.
Impotence.
Yes. Only the great people realize sensational as heaven is impotent, you know?
Right.
Bravo, 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 bravo. Bonjour, bonjour.
Barcelona was the most sophisticated city in Spain, a sort of small Paris by the sea. Dali's mother came from there, and Dali often visited it as a child and adolescent. He loved the strange, soft buildings by Antoni Gaudí. And this place where I'm standing in, this bar, used to be a famous bookshop, the most famous bookshop in Barcelona, the Libreria Verdaguer. The bookshop was owned by his uncle, Anselm Domènech, and it was the centre of the Catalan literary renaissance in the 19th century. And Dali used to come here. His uncle was interested in literature, interested in art, sort of got him European art journals, magazines that nobody in Madrid had seen. So when Dali arrived in Madrid, he had all these things under his arm, all these magazines about Cubism and Futurism. And it all happened here. So this is really one of the magic spaces in Dali's adolescence. In 1922, having completed his state baccalaureate, Dali was sent by his ambitious father to study painting at Madrid's Royal Academy School. He stayed at the famous students' residence, the most culturally advanced university hostel in the country. His fellow students included the poet Federico García Lorca, the future filmmaker Luis Buñuel, and José Bello, known to his friends as Pepín, the last survivor of the group.
¿Cuántos años tienes? Más o menos. ¿90?
90. La misma edad de Dalí, exactamente igual.
Naciste el mismo año, ¿no?
El mismo, un día antes, un día después, un día.
El año 1904.
4. Y un día pasé por la habitación, que era en el segundo pabellón, en la planta baja, pasé por su habitación, que estaba la puerta abierta, y estaba él dentro, y me metí. Estaban allí porque estaba todo el suelo lleno de dibujos y las paredes y tal. Y le dije, ¿esto es tuyo? ¿Estos son? Dice, sí, son. Y yo lo estuve viendo y me parecieron estupendos. Y Dalí iba vestido con una... Bueno, llevaba una melena negra, una boina de punto, pero que se metía hasta las orejas, y una chaqueta de terciopelo negro.
¿Y vosotros ibais muy correctamente vestidos? ¿No?
Normales. No, correctos, normales. No se prescindía de la corbata nunca. Íbamos con corbata siempre.
Te ruego que me expliques un poco, porque Dalí, claro, es conocido mundialmente como el gran exhibicionista y Dalí y tal y cual, pero tú has dicho...
Eso es la reacción a su timidez. Esa audacia de la que ha presumido y ha pasado a la posteridad, esa audacia de Dalí, ese desgarro de Dalí, eso es la lucha contra su propia timidez. Y Dalí era un tímido absolutamente, un tímido de arriba abajo.
Tú has dicho que...
Dalí era un tímido casi patológico.
¿Se expresaba en castellano?
Sí.
Sí, pero de una manera muy catalana, ¿o cómo era? ¿Tenía problemas a la hora de decir cosas?
No tenía problemas. Él hablaba el español relativamente mal, pero como hablaba el catalán mal, y el francés mal, y el inglés mal, los hablaba todos mal.
¿Y escribía mal?
Y escribía peor. Claro.
The group sent humorous notes and doodles to each other all the time. Their letters and postcards have been published with commentaries by Rafael Santos Torruella, Spain's leading Dali expert, who's been enormously helpful to me in my work.
Pero de todas maneras, con el otro viendo a ver lo que le va a pasar. Lo ha copiado aquí. Míralo, es el SD con un ojo tapado. Con un ojo tapado y con el otro abierto espiando lo que ve. Bueno, se reúnen en una plaza aquí bajo un farol.
¿Me muestras un segundo, por favor?
Bajo un farol se reúnen aquí en la plaza. Aquí se encuentran Maruja Mayo, la veréis más clara. Aquí Dalí, veis la melena en la sombra, igual que aquí.
Y Buñuel aparece,
Y aquí Buñuel, míralo, con aquí está Buñuel. Sí. El que le sigue es Buñuel, con las espaldas cuadradas. El que le sigue es Dalí, alto, con aquellas melenas, que parecía una chica.
I was told that the girl in the painting, Maruja Mayu, wanted to see me. She was a fellow art student. I particularly loved this self-portrait. I was shocked by the decline in her health since we'd last met, and I realized I couldn't understand what she seemed to want to tell me about her life and the people she'd known.
She remembers Dali, she remembers Lorca, she remembers Buñuel. They inaugurated a new movement in Madrid which was not wearing hats, because in those days, in the early 1920s, everyone wore hats. It was called sin sombrerismo, without hats. And Maruja was the leader of the group, and they refused to wear hats, and it was considered most unconventional. She was a very unconventional lady.
Fuimos sencillamente los iniciadores del sinsombrerismo, y después nos impulsó un deseo inmenso de conocer los cantos gregorianos de Silos. Y allí nos lanzamos un día y los eclesiásticos nos dijeron que no podían entrar faldas. Entonces resolvimos prontamente la controversia de la idea religiosa poniéndonos como chaquetas los pantalones de Dalí y de Federico.
Al revés, las chaquetas de ellos
las
como
chaquetas
pantalones,
como
¿no?
pantalones. Así es que fuimos las promotoras del travestis a la inversa.
Lorca was the great friend and came to visit Dali in Cadaqués in 1925 and again in 1927. He got on splendidly with Dali's family and appears in lots of photographs, drawings and paintings. In one photograph we see Lorca doing one of his favorite tricks, enacting his own death. Dali used the photograph to do one of his first paintings of the poet. There must be 30 or 40 paintings by Dali from this period, which his head appears fused with Lorca's. This derives from Picasso. Picasso's got heroic heads on tables, but Dali gives it a new twist by making it very biographical. So that you can see the outline of Lorca's head. This rather chubby bit here is Lorca, and then Dali's little sticky out ear on the other side. It is really wonderful to see these paintings brought together in this room, because I can see on the other wall another series of paintings from the same period, which one finds the fused heads of Lorca and Dali, relating to his deep friendship with Lorca. A friendship that for Lorca was intensely passionate, because Lorca by this time was in love with Dali. Dali, who was terrified of perhaps having homosexual tendencies himself, tended to be very guarded, and always claimed afterwards that he hadn't allowed Lorca to possess him. But there's no doubt whatsoever that Lorca was passionately involved with Dali by the year of 1926. Over here on the right-hand side, we see Lorca's head, his severed head, lying on the edge of the beach. Sleeping peacefully or dead, we don't know. But it's a beach littered with severed members and suggestions of death, but done in a very nightmarish way with a stark precision. This is really a spectral beach. Then at the bottom of the picture, in the right-hand corner, is one of Dali's specialities, the rotting donkey, which of course reappears in the film he made with Buñuel, Un chien andalou. Dali himself was literally roped in to play one of the priests.
When I met Dali, not long before he died, he said to me, my great friend Lorca, he hated women's breasts. And I said, but maestro, I have the impression that you didn't particularly like women's breasts either. No, he said, but I paint them flying. I paint them flying in pairs. And here we have a splendid pair of flying breasts. I've just seen that the donkey is being assailed by a hexagon. Looks like a sodomitic hexagon trying to have it over the donkey, while the donkey is occupied in catching fish. And as the eye goes up the figure, we find at the top a red hand with the pulsating veins standing out. And this has been interpreted by the critics, and I think they're right, as the red hand of the masturbator caught in flagranti with his fantasy.
Un Chien Andalou was first shown in Paris in 1929. All the surrealists saw it, including André Breton, the movement's founder.
At that time, Dali was unknown to Breton. He hadn't joined the surrealists. Breton came to this. Buñuel said, Dali wasn't here, I think. Buñuel said he loaded up a lot of rocks behind the screen if the audience turned out he was going to throw them
Yes,
at them.
a typical Aragonese gesture.
Yes. But on the other hand, it was an enormous success with Tout Paris.
Yeah.
And Breton was asked what he thought of it, and he said it is a surrealist film. And from then on, Buñuel was the golden boy, and Dali soon joined him.
Dali
Yes.
was fanatical about
completely.
surrealism, and he applied the letter of the law.
He did.
I mean, hatred of family, well, he got himself thrown out. Hatred of religion in his speeches. He attacks Catholicism as
Yes.
nobody else was attacking Catholicism.
Yes.
And then the patrie, the fatherland, his
No, he was
scorn for the
brilliant.
country comes
And of course, he turned everything upside down on his head later and became in favor of family, in favor of religion,
Yeah.
and so on. But at this moment, I think he probably added the great touches to the Andalusian dog. I mean, it's his imagination. One sees that in the pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Buñuel was extremely bright and clever and funny. But there is a fanaticism about those two early films that is not in the later Buñuel.
I think there is a great deal of Dali in the first
I
film.
think Buñuel more or less acknowledges
Yeah.
that Dali was a genius, but that he was also a swine.
The trouble is, when people come to write their memoirs,
Yes.
they tend to distort. Maybe you find the same thing. And Buñuel is not trustworthy. None of them are really. Dali isn't trustworthy in The Secret Life.
Certainly not.
So you've got to go, if you can, to the correspondence and to contemporary documents,
Yes.
to the newspapers.
Mm.
Because what I've been trying to do is to get hold of the correspondence between Buñuel and Noailles, and then between Dali and Buñuel. And
Yes.
it's tricky. The difficulty is tracking down the contemporary documents, which
Yes.
get closer to the truth, obviously.
In the end, it's letters.
Letters, yeah.
It's not memoir.
Letters.
true.
And there aren't many of those in
La vérité,
Spain.
c'est que je vous trouve aujourd'hui un peu pensif, un peu fatigué peut-être, entouré d'enfants qui sont venus au Grévin.
The surrealists, as you might expect, were fascinated by wax museums, by tailor's dummies. And they came often to this place, this magic place, when they loved the blurring of appearance and reality that you get in museums like this. Dali had read a poem by Jean Cocteau in which he mentions the Musée Grévin. And when he came to Paris in 1926, the main object of meeting Picasso and seeing the Louvre, he also made a beeline for the Musée Grévin.
Wax is not only the matter that lends itself best to the imitation of living forms and figures. It is, at the same time, spectral and macabre. It is further augmented by an attractive softness. Upon exposure to heat, its liquefaction, with the disfiguration which this entails, may easily appear as characteristic of the decomposition of corpses.
Dali was crazy about the Art Nouveau metro entrances in Paris.
What he found out so wonderful about it was he said it looked like edible architecture. You know, break a one.
The Venetians.
And one also sees the influence of it. I mean, he did know Barcelona also, of course. He was crazy about Art Nouveau in general, or what he called the modern style for some reason.
Oh, yeah.
But to
modern
see,
style.
the name represents a very important, of course, surrealist principle, the certainty of chance.
The certainty of chance.
I mean, here we are making a film largely about Dali, and it immediately appears on a tarpaulin.
Wherever Dali is, there is a happening. Dali joined the Surrealists because it was the most revolutionary movement around. It drew its inspiration from the individual unconscious and was socially subversive. André Breton was his high priest, and for a while at least, almost a second father to Dali. Breton had co-written one of the earliest Surrealist texts here in the Hôtel des Grands Hommes. Dali was drawn to the Surrealists, and for a while, they needed him.
he came into Surrealism and revived it. It was dying on its feet. The painting was becoming duller and duller, more and more automatic. There were brilliant people like Miro and so on. And this young man who could spout invention very fast, and who Picasso, he went to see, said of Dali's mind, absolutely brilliant analogy, he said he's got a mind like an outboard motor. It is very good, that. The mind did drive him.
Yes, and Éluard called him a thinking machine that never stopped.
Yes, incredible. And of course, he's glamorous, I suppose, in the manner of the time. He looked like a gigolo, you know, with those popular looks, flamboyant, and didn't mind what he did or said.
And with the daring of the timid, because on one occasion he said...
One of his surrealist friends was the poet Paul Éluard. Dali invited him and his wife Gala to Cadaqués, and it was love at first sight. All hell broke loose. Gala was a Russian mystery woman with a fabulous body who'd been in bed with everybody. Dali had been in bed with nobody. He was initiated by one of the most experienced people in the business. He was never the same after that moment.
Es Gala, que viene con Paul Éluard a Cadaqués. Yo abro la puerta y me la encuentro ya desnuda. Y entonces me enamoró automáticamente. Pero como que era muy tímido, como lo soy aún, y histérico, en aquel momento histérico porque nunca me había aún masturbado, o sea que llevaba una cantidad de retraso, de esperma incalculable.
¿Y cuántos años tenía?
Entonces tenía 22 años.
Y ya que veníamos de Gala, ¿qué le debe usted a Gala?
Todo.
Absolutamente todo.
Hay una cosa, eso ya lo he dicho a la televisión, pero nadie lo cree, es la única mujer que yo he hecho el amor.
¿Qué le debe usted a Gala como artista y como genio?
Sobre todo el convencimiento que tengo ahora, gracias a ella, de que no soy tan mediocre como lo creía. Porque ella creyó enseguida que tenía un gran talento. Yo al contrario creí que no.
This is the Rue Becquerel in Montmartre at the foot of the Sacré-Cœur. And it was here that Dali and Gala had their first love nest in Paris. The love nest was rented by Paul Éluard for him and Gala, but it was Dali who moved in.
When the Dalis moved across town, they were visited by a young English writer, David Gascoigne, who was fascinated by surrealism, and who translated some of Dali's most complicated texts.
On an easel in the middle of the apartment was, here we are, the loaf of bread and
the famous
an
loaf
inkwell based on Millet's Angelus. That was a feature of the studio. And another feature was a huge, well, pretty large canvas called the Great Masturbator, the Grand Mastur, but...
Which must have, I imagine, struck you forcibly.
Well, it would strike anybody forcibly, yes. His interpretation of the Angelus of Millet is that the peasant woman is a praying mantis, and that the man with his hat here is hiding his erection. Well, anyway, it's not so much an anti-religious picture, but it really was a sort of illustration of his obsessions. But he did have a most extraordinary technique, and some of the paintings of that period. Before he went to America, I think are of his greatest... I do remember him showing me his brushes, and one of them had about 3 hairs, tiny hairs, a tiny little brush. And he really painted with great passion.
Was he using a magnifying glass? Or?
Yes, I think, yes, indeed, yes. He had a little, you know, the kind that jewelers use. He screwed into his eye to do certain details.
Really?
He really had a complete mastery of a representational technique.
Dali said the idea of the melting watches in his painting The Persistence of Memory came to him one evening after he'd eaten a piece of camembert cheese. Gala had gone to the cinema, and when she returned, she just stood there. "No one will ever forget it," she said.
He was helpful. He showed me various objects in the studio. For instance, to illustrate his thing of the double images, the paranoid critical double image, there was this wonderful postcard that he discovered in a flea market of an African kraal or hut like that, with some natives sitting outside. And he turned it the other way up, sideways, and saw a face in it. Well, then he'd made a little painting reproducing the postcard, but accentuating the face. And he called the head a portrait of the Marquis de Sade. But one can use this explanation of the double image and the visual pun being based on someone who has persecution mania sees the proof of his persecution in some quite objective thing in the outer world. I mean, one can know that and be interested in that and use it as a theory without necessarily being afraid of going mad yourself.
Absolutely.
I think that Dali, when he said that he's a madman who happens not to be mad, is perfectly right.
The world of dreams is a strange world which most of us visit only in our sleep. The whole aim of surrealism is to explore this world and to bring it into relation with our daily life.
Dali came to the London exhibition, the Surrealist exhibition, which caused a tremendous stir in London in that year, and thousands of people came every day. I don't know whose idea it was that he should dress up in a diver's suit and give a lecture about the mysteries of the inner depths of the unconscious, but he did. And before long, he started to give this lecture, and it was very hardly audible. He began to gasp and to pant, and somebody had to rush out to a spanner, and I think it was I, and how I managed to find a spanner in Bond Street in the afternoon, I don't know what I did, and so we released him.
The other great London experience for Dali was meeting his hero Freud in 1938.
Allí hubo una escena terrible porque yo le enseñé mi cuadro La Metamorfosis de Narciso, que me gustó mucho. El cuadro no me interesa, yo quisiera que usted leyera mi tesis sobre la paranoia crítica que he hecho con Lacan. Y él volvía al cuadro, yo volvía a que leyera mi tesis científica. Y al final, puñetazo, digo, quiero que lea esta noche. Entonces Freud se quedó un poco asombrado y dijo a Stefan Zweig, nunca he visto un prototipo de español más claramente. Es un fanático. Esa es la palabra de Freud.
Dali had been reading Freud with fascination since the early 1920s, when Freud began to be published in Madrid. So that when he got to Paris in 1929, it could be said that he knew as much about him as the Surrealists themselves. And Gala was also an avid disciple.
Were you living with Gala and Salvador in Paris?
At the beginning, I had a room in a little hotel just across the street from them, but then I had lunch with them, and then on Sundays I stayed the whole day with them, and then they took care of me. And Gala was always fantastic with me.
That's what I wanted to ask you
I have nothing against Gala. They may say anything people will against Gala. She probably had things which weren't right, I don't know. She made Salvador, she did it. Because when he went to Paris, he was just a boy from Provincias. Well, only later on, maybe Gala turned a little bit too commercial, but at the beginning it was what he needed, to have someone like Gala beside him.
Yo la recuerdo fea. Ella tenía un cuerpo también bueno, pero todo eso no daba la sensación de una mujer con personalidad y inteligente ni nada de eso. Así la recuerdo yo. Era mayor que Dalí. Tenía unos ojos pequeños de gata. era muy especial su mirada. Le transformó, claro, y entonces empezó a leer los libros del Marqués de Sade, y cuando vino a nuestra casa tenía todos los tirantes con escenas del Marqués de Sade.
¿Cómo? ¿Los tirantes?
Los tirantes, sí, sí.
¿Con dibujos?
Con dibujos.
¿Pero hechos por él?
No sé, con dibujos. Y yo dije, ¿pero qué te has hecho ahí? Dice, son muy bonitos.
Ah, pero son dibujos eróticos.
Claro, el Marqués de Sade, ¿cómo van a ser?
For Dali, shame and sexual desire were inextricably linked together, and from adolescence onwards he made thousands of erotic drawings.
¿Tú sabes que lo que le hizo al padre?
¿No?
Pues el padre decía, cuando llevó a Cadaqués, a Aragón, a Plever, a todos los surrealistas, se bañaban desnudos con unos collares de rosas y entraban y el notario dijo, ¿pero qué es eso? Tus amigos son unos depravados y tal. No son depravados, y mira, lo que te debo te lo doy. Y cogió un plástico, echó el semen y se lo mandó al padre.
¿Pero cómo sabes tú eso? ¿Quién te ha dicho esto?
Hombre, lo he presenciado.
¿Cómo? ¿Que Dalí mandó un paquete de esperma?
Sí.
¿A su padre?
A su padre, sí.
¿Cómo es posible?
Pues...
¿Pero cómo es posible eso?
Pues es posible porque lo hizo. Y el padre dijo, ya no quiero tratar contigo. Se enfadó muchísimo.
Ah, es normal, ¿no?
Dali's mother died of cancer when he was only 16, and shortly afterwards his father married the dead woman's sister. From that moment on, it seems that Dali's relationship with his father became more and more difficult.
This painting is very important because it's the painting that got Dali thrown out of his home by his father. It's a painting he exhibited in Paris at the end of the 1920s. It's a figure of God the Father Almighty, and here's the Sacred Heart. And Dali has written in French, "Sometimes I spit for fun on the portrait of my mother." It's one of the oddest portraits of a mother ever executed. It was a terrible shock to the father because the mother had died in 1921, 8 or 9 years earlier. And it was a terrible family tragedy. So really the most sacred aspect of that family was the mother, and to spit on the portrait of the mother in the guise of God the Father Almighty was a dreadful insult, and Dali's father simply threw him out.
Dali was determined not to be pushed out of the area by his tyrannical father, so he bought a fisherman's cottage just over the hill in Portligat, and in direct opposition to him settled down there with Gala. Over the years, he expanded the property with the addition of adjoining cottages. Dali painted the Bay of Portligat over and over again. It was one of the places he most loved in the world. And what must most have delighted him was that Portligat and its bay received the first sunlight in Spain. Dali's father and sister are buried in the little cemetery of San Baldiri, halfway between Cadaqués and Portligat. The irony is that the cemetery looks down on Salvador Dali's house, which incredibly they were never able to visit.
Pero no, porque ellos eran de allí y ella estaba a la rima de su padre. Ella no dejó nunca el sitio de su padre allí. Sí, sí, este fue el dominio de Salvador. Y hay otra razón para la que no viniera, era también el dominio de Gala. Y por eso no podía venir la
Pero es patético, Rafael, ¿no?
Patético, muy patético. El padre y Ana María Dalí Domènech, la hija, incluso estuve invitado por ellos en su casa. Aquí conservo un gran recuerdo. Era una persona excepcional, el padre muy enérgico, muy fuerte de carácter, pero al mismo tiempo era una persona muy cordial, muy amena, muy recibiendo siempre muy bien a los amigos y a las personas. Adoraba a su hijo, pero es esa relación de amor-odio que se da a veces en las relaciones paterno-filiales, ¿no? Dalí amaba a su padre extraordinariamente, lo temía porque era muy autoritario, pero precisamente lo admiraba porque veía en él lo que a él le faltaba, esa autoridad que él quería tener igual que el padre, pero no conseguía imponerla como quería. Y Ana María Dalí, la sombra de su hermano continuamente, que también adoraba a su hermano, estaba enamorada de su hermano, y también es la tragedia de Salvador. Salvador destruía todo lo que quería. Las cosas que escribió de su hermana, el poema L'amour et la mémoire, es de las cosas más horribles que un hermano puede escribir de una hermana.
Having offended his family, Dali went back to Barcelona and defended the cultural establishment of the Ateneo, the city's most venerable arts club. There's a marvelous snatch of film of Dali being convivial with the other members. They couldn't have suspected how offensive he was going to be a few years later when he was invited to come here and give a lecture on surrealism. And the place was absolutely packed. There were dignitaries, the cultural establishment was there. And he began by insulting the audience. He said something along the lines of, "There is one most terrible thing in the world, which is to give one lecture. And there is one even more vile, revolting thing, which is to do what you are doing here today, is to listen to a lecture." That's how he began. And then he went on to insult Catalonia, to attack the church, the fatherland, and the family, and he'd just been thrown out of his own family. People began to rush out of the doorways to hurl abuse, and people were very offended. And the following day in the press, Dali was labelled as a great enemy of Catalonia, which I suppose is what he wanted. Dali was determined to shock, as was his friend Luis Buñuel. And the film they were working on together, L'Âge d'Or, set out to do this on the grand scale.
If you wink at the screen.
They beat up members of the audience with clubs.
Yes.
And they destroyed everything in the foyer.
Exactly what surrealism always claimed it loved, to actually irritate and annoy its enemies so much that they actually turned to violence.
The opening scene was shot at Cap Creus, just around the corner from Port Lligat, and one of the most remarkable places on the whole Mediterranean. Dali called Creus the crossroads of the winds of Catalonia, a place of optical illusions where weird metamorphoses take place before our eyes, and the rocks inspired some of Dali's most arresting images. Again, the hidden face of shame. Elsewhere, the rocks assume human features expressing the conflicts in his life at the time, with his father, his sister, with sexuality, and of course with the Catholic Church. This is a sort of idealized or stylized version of the head of the father, leering with sort of sexual lechery at what's going on in this group. On his shoulder is resting a figure who appears to be ashamed, because he was terrified of sex and ashamed of his body. All of this had been instilled into him as a child, and he never fully got free from it. This is the host, and that's the chalice, and there's blood at the center of the host. And Dali is sort of spitting, but the spit is a sort of saliva
which I think in his mind is a symbol of sperm. What Dali has done is to turn a supreme symbol of faith in the Christian message into a symbol of horror. Because one of the most disgusting things anybody could do, any Christian could do, to the sacred cup and to the sacred host would be to masturbate over them. And that is what, in fact, is happening in this painting, although it may be unrecognized by many people who look at it.
It was not long before Dali began to offend the surrealists themselves. Things came to a head in January 1934, when Breton summoned Dali to Rue Fontaine to answer the charge of being pro-Hitler.
So this was the entrance to the Sanctus Sanctorum.
Dali was called to heel because he'd started to paint Hitler a lot and went on and on about the great paranoia of Berchtesgaden. And of course, the surrealists were violently anti-Nazi. So they called him to a sort of kangaroo court in the Rue de Fontaine. And they were all there. Jean was there. He said that if Dali had performed as he did that day on the music hall, he would have made a fortune. He appeared claiming he had a bad cold and wearing 12 sweaters, which he alternatively took off and put on, taking his temperature all the time, taking his socks off and on, while they were all saying, "Why do you paint Hitler?" And in the end he said, "Because I am a surrealist. And you yourself said that we must paint without any moral intervention. And I dream about Hitler, so I paint him. And furthermore, then comes your bit. Furthermore, every night I dream I'm sodomizing you, and I will paint it, you see." They were lost. Even Breton couldn't keep the grave reserve he usually dismissed people with. Breton had always been suspicious of him. In a very, very early article on him, he said, "I cannot help wondering if in 10 years' time we will hear the admirable voice of Dali, or only the creaking of his patent leather shoes."
Y entonces yo ya en este momento me declaré apolítico totalmente, pero al mismo tiempo monárquico y anarquista, pero no políticamente, metafísicamente.
Dali's politics were always ambiguous. This 1936 painting, Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, was strategically retitled Premonition of Civil War, a war in which Dali favored General Franco from a safe distance. Dali and Gala spent the 3 years of the Spanish Civil War in Paris, but when the Germans invaded France, they made a beeline for New York. He'd already made several successful visits, and now it seemed not only a haven of safety, but also a potential pot of gold.
And tomorrow night, Omnibus looks at the commercialisation of Salvador Dali. That's at 10:30 here on BBC One.